Over to you and our online community, if there are any questions from them. So I'm going to take maybe 2 or 3 at a time. Then I'll put them together and put them to our panel. So we've got one over here, one at the back there. I'll take one more, number 3. So if you could just, we've got the mics coming around. Just tell us who you are and where you work.
Hi, my name is Naku Ado, and I'm a research analyst with Sumitomo Bank. And I'm just trying to understand probably 2 separate questions. The first one is, how does Africa compare to other regions? Because it seems a lot of attention is focused on Africa as having, like you said with the newspaper articles, you always see those articles about Africa. And I'm just curious about how, in terms of supply of water, it would compare to, say, Australia or the US, where there's far more intensive use of water, number 1. And then number 2, towards the end of the discussion, we talked about economic water scarcity. And apart from the fact that there's less investment in infrastructure, are there any technological obstacles to actually accessing water, apart from just the lack of capital to build out the infrastructure to supply water?
Thanks. Second question was at the back, I think, yeah.
This is a question about measurement.
And you are?
Oh, I'm Catherine Porvelmacher from African Rainbow Consulting.
Thanks.
The FAO was using, if you look at the Aquastat database and you look at the information about water in each country, a lot of it dates back to 2004. And yet solving water scarcity or water poverty is it comes under the Millennium Development Goals. So how are they measuring the progress? If more and more people must have access to drinking water, safe drinking water and water for sanitation under the development goals, and yet the stats on the FAO still date back to 2004, who's measuring what's happened in between? So how do we know where we're at? Somebody must be doing it, right?
Yes. Good. And finally, over at the front here, this gentleman.
Thank you. My name's Frank Greaves. I work for Tier Funders as WASH advisor. Thank you very much, Richard and Alan, for your enlightening talks. That was very good. Just a question and partly a comment. Given that we're really talking about adaptation, and given also the fact that many of the figures we just don't really know, I just wonder, in respect of access to clean water, shouldn't we really be focusing as much on multi-source use of water for access, and not putting aside the issue of quality, but looking at multi-sources, then talking about particularly, say, point-of-use treatment in the home, and bringing out the importance that this has in access to water use across the globe, and talking more as well about water reuse and water conservation and the sand dams in respect of storage and so on. Isn't that such a major figure in respect of adaptation today, rather than saying that groundwater storage we're underestimating, but we're not actually accessing? Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, 3 good questions, or 4, if we count them all up. Now, I'm not going to let the panel have a go at each one, maybe, although I'm not going to be too dictatorial, but we've got a question about comparisons, Africa, other regions. Just what are we talked about economic scarcity. What are these barriers to access? Economic, infrastructural, funding, capacity. That was over here on my right. We've got a question of measurement, progress against the MDGs. And finally, a question from the front here about multiple sources. Richard, why don't you have a go at the regional comparison, and then maybe the progress one, Richard, you could deal with briefly.
the first thing to recognize is that as it's currently defined, you're asking me about water scarcity in Africa as it's currently defined in relation to other regions.
Water supply.
Water supply. Oh, you mean okay, okay. So there's just to emphasize that again, there's a very big difference between freshwater availability and water supply, if you want to go. So for instance, water scarcity, again, speaks nothing of how the water is delivered. And your question is more about how the water is delivered. Is it?
I mean, I understand what you've just described as the problems with measurement of water scarcity.
Yeah.
But, you know, in all the newspaper articles, there seems to be this concept that Africa is running out of water, but at the same time, you have other regions of the world looking to invest in African land, for example, because there's more water there versus other places. You know, so I'm just not playing my mind how Africa stands in comparison to, say, you know, if the US is using water at such an intensive rate, are they running out of water? You know, so maybe these are, I'm not using the right technical terms. So I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, there are a number. I guess there's a number of kind of conflating issues there. But if we think, yes, there are other areas of the world that are using much more water at the moment than, let's say, Africa is using for whether, as I mentioned, in terms of irrigated agriculture. Clearly, areas that would compare in terms of water scarcity are very dry areas in the Middle East. Obviously, are very, very dry, and they would depend on irrigation for any kind of agricultural productivity to take place. There are countries in the Middle East, also in Asia, who are investing in arable land in Africa, as you probably know, and much of their investment focuses on arable land, not strictly speaking at the moment water resources, but there's an interesting component there about how interested they are in the water. It's a bit like when we have the Commission for Africa of advocating for, or many other people advocating for increased agricultural productivity. Great, sounds good. Africa is a continent of farmers, okay? But is there the water? Is there the water there to sustain the kind of increases in agricultural productivity that people are demanding? That's a question. I think that's an open question. I'm still not sure I've answered your question entirely, but Africa has many countries that are under conditions of water scarcity and water stress. There are countries that, Israel and many areas in the Middle East, that are under more severe conditions of water, or their water scarcity is greater. But when we talk about water supply and delivery, Africa is as a continent is suffering greater from economic water scarcity than any other continent. I don't know if that puts it.
Well, Richard, you might like to add a little bit more to that before you deal with the question about measurement of progress.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just mention measurement of progress first, because I think that's where the information comes from. And many of you will know, but not necessarily everybody, that the measurement of progress in terms of water supply coverage is carried out through the joint monitoring program of WHO and UNICEF. That's really where our statistics come from. And the latest report actually came out on Monday of this week. You've got there, great.
On the website.
Which reports on data for 2008. It's always 2 years behind, but it's the most up-to-date we have, and it's the most consistent and comprehensive data. So just in relation to the question that you asked about Aquastat, I would say that the FAO Aquastat database is not so relevant to these issues of water supply coverage and progress towards coverage. But the JMP data is, because that's reflecting real investment in the sector. But just to add a little bit to the first question about obstacles, is it just money or is it other things as well? Part of it, I think, is also about absorptive capacity of the institutions involved and the effectiveness of their targeting in terms of investment. We know from a lot of the work that WaterAid's done that the targeting of investment is not always what it could be in order to meet the needs of those who are least well served. But the final point I'll make is just in relation to the question of keeping water supply services going, keeping them working the whole question of functional sustainability. And as we make more progress in the sector, and there is steady progress, although in many places it's slow, inevitably there needs to be much more emphasis on keeping systems working rather than just going on investing in new ones. And we really haven't addressed that as fully as we should have done yet, we, the sector.
Good. Okay, Alan, do you want to pick this last point? Multiple sources.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Frank, for the question. I think it's a very important question, and this is about whether, or the importance of having more than one water source. There's different levels to it. I think the first thing I would like to say is that it's good for people not to have to rely on one source of water, because if that fails, then they're toiling, really, and they've got to go for much further afield. Now, this raises issues with putting in new water supplies, whether there should be more access for people, putting in 2 boreholes instead of one communities, so it builds in a bit of redundancy. Now, there's issues there about that's denying other people access or not. So that's what's one part of it, the importance of people to rely on more than just one source of water in case it dries up. But I think what your question was really about was maybe improving the sources of water people are using at the moment. So at the moment, maybe people are using shallow wells, because before somebody comes along to improve the water supply, people are drinking something. So whether the first step should be to improve that water source, and this is very current at the moment. There's a lot of people pushing that, and I can see the reasons for that. However, I would urge caution with that as well, because a lot of the existing sources people use are very, very poor quality. So the water needs to be treated for it to be of a certain acceptable pathogen-free or low pathogen water quality. A lot of them are poor quality water, and also a lot of them dry up throughout the year. So there might be an issue there about potentially a changing climate or whatever, that if you put a lot of reliance on these sources, they might dry up. So that brings me on to another point, which you raised as well, which was treatment of these water sources. Why not just, instead of putting in new water supplies, why don't we just encourage people or help people to treat water in their own households? And that is an important question, which I don't think quite has been researched as fully as it should. There has been several, if anybody follows the literature, and there's been a lot of hotly disputed papers and discussion about it. But there haven't really been the studies to show whether these things work in the long term. So you might have chlorine tablets or something, or some filtration in somebody's house. They put in the poor quality water from their pond. It gets treated. There's a research project for 6 months which follows that. Everything's fine. The water's good. Everybody's happy. What happens in the next year? What happens 2 years after that? Do the people still have the money to maintain that system? How robust they are. So I think there's an awful lot of questions still needed to be answered before that particular policy can be pushed.
Okay, good. More questions. Okay, 1, and 2. Let's take 2 this time. Okay, so.
Yes, hello. Jenny Groundwater from IIED's Human Settlements Group. My question actually relates directly to what you brought up at the end now, Alan. What we see in the research on urban dependence on groundwater, especially shallow wells, that the very, very poorest in many African countries rely on. There is a link between the use of shallow wells, very shallow wells, the water quality, pathogens, and home treatment. And one city that we are looking at is Lusaka, Zambia, where the authorities want to ban the use of the very shallow wells, the dog shallow wells, because they do see a link between the cholera outbreaks. My question is, because as you mentioned, there is a lot of research on the benefits of interventions, and maybe these research studies haven't been looking at the benefits in the very long run. But basically, the linkage between cholera and the shallow wells is mainly there during the rainy season. So will interventions with chlorine, what do you see as the effects of that throughout the year as in relation to during the rainy season? I hope you get my question.
Thanks. The second question was from John Chilton over there.
John Chilton, International Association of Hydrogeologists. This is a comment really addressed to Alan and Richard, who've mentioned the no regrets policy and the cost of improving coverage. As you know, of the 320 million that you mentioned uncovered, quite a lot of these live in pretty difficult groundwater areas. And I think we have to accept the possible need for disproportionate investment in siting and construction to catch these people. And it still may be, even with disproportionate investment, groundwater still may be the cheapest and most secure option. Do you think that's a reasonable possibility?
Okay. Right. Alan, the first question was picked up on this discussion about water quality, treatment, and so on. I guess Richard might want to say something about that, and maybe Richard, you could deal with John's point.
Okay, just before Richard jumps in, I would urge caution about banning anything. When people are going to ban something, I think that's always a bad sign. I just think that there needs to be a very mature debate before these things are pushed out. I think there's always going to be, or there is going to be a need for household water treatment in the kind of portfolio of water supply options, particularly in an urban area when your town supply is intermittently working. Having treatment options there, I think, is probably a good idea. You mentioned the rainy season. I think that's something that concerns me a little bit about latrine latrine construction and use, and the use of shallow wells, because a little bit of research that I've managed to do on that seems to show quite a high connection in the rainy season in some environments, not all environments, but in some environments in the rainy season, getting connection between the two of them. So that's not to say it's not a good idea everywhere. It's just in some locations it might be an issue. But, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, this issue of self-supply, as you're referring to, in particularly peri-urban locations, I'm not sure that we know the scale of it, but one thing I'm convinced of is that it is very extensive. I've just finished supervising a PhD on exactly this topic, self-supply from hand-dug wells in a Nigerian city. And there are thousands of hand-dug wells in the one city alone. The approach we took in that research was to look at the potential for the use of water safety plans as an approach to the preservation of health among the communities using those and the households using them. But of course, you're in a situation where those sources are not managed by a utility or an authority of any sort, and there may well be public authorities that at times try to close them down. But I do agree with Alan. I think the idea of trying to close things down is something to be very cautious about, because of what else will people do? Rainy season contamination is a big issue. I mean, I think we probably all know that fecal coliform counts or fecal contamination spikes in the rainy season or soon after rain. So it is very likely that if you've got hand-dug wells and on-site sanitation in close proximity, then you're going to see those sort of impacts. There are not easy solutions.
Yeah.
Okay, if you don't mind, I want to make one sentence on the last topic, and then I'll move on to the. Just one thing I would argue, though, and is that possibly worse, probably worse, is no sanitation. So we talk about the risk of pit latrines on water quality, but it may be that the absence of sanitation in a particular environment, urban environment, may be a bigger threat to water quality.
Yeah.
In relation to John's question, I think it's pretty fast and simple. I would, sorry if you don't mind me saying so, I would just say yes, that the disproportionate investment is required, because in many cases, what are the choices? There aren't any options, and if we go back to Alan's slide of low rainfall in particular months, and you're not in the vicinity of any surface water sources, well, are we telling that there are no-go areas for people to live? I don't think really that's and I would think that we have to. I come from Canada, of course, and not of course, but I do, and well, that's a funny accent. Now, if you wanted to run a mail system in Canada, okay, it's completely uneconomic to deliver mail to people in Northern Ontario, okay? You accept that as a society, as a cost, okay? It's just that's part of how that society has to operate. And I think one thing we would have to come up with, recognize, is to serve water to people in certain circumstances will cost more than it will in some urban environments. And we just have to, in society, we have to accept that, and that has to be accepted. That those disproportionate costs have to be recognized as acceptable, not unacceptable. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, what have we got? Another 5 minutes, so it's time for 2-3 more questions. Yep, we've got one over here, two, and there was sorry if I didn't look left there, but there was one over there. Did anyone have their hand up over there? No, that is not that anyone is admitting. Right, off you go.
Although I'd like to ask Alan very much about the McCurdy sandstone and how he actually ultimately found solutions in McCurdy. He did. I'm Simon Bibby. I'm a consultant mainly on sort of public health issues. So I'm sort of very interested to hear about the sanitation stuff that you were doing as well, because I think one of the arguments is in support of ecological sanitation in peri-urban areas, because you can lift the latrines up and have sky loos and actually prevent the contamination there. But the other thing I was interested to know was in terms of actually boosting groundwater storage, whether you can actually find viable ways of recharging aquifers and actually artificially boosting these existing groundwater sources. What sort of experience you've had in doing that, particularly in sort of an area like Malawi, where so much of the surface runoff ends up in the lake or in Mozambique. So I just wondered whether you had some thoughts about that.
Okay. Now yep. Oh no, sorry. Number 2 was over here. Number 3 over there. Yeah.
Raffaella, Head-On Household Energy Network. Thinking energy, as we are at Head-On, are potentially energy water systems, something innovative energy water systems, something to look at. One of the slides in Richard's presentation had the amount of seawater, for example, available. So desalination comes to mind based on renewable energy systems, of course. Is there much done? What are the panelists' thoughts on this?
Okay.
Hi, Sarah Delaney from Imperial College. Just a quick question and comment. I just didn't know if, Richard, if you could explain the calculation of how rainwater harvesting is 10 times more expensive than groundwater. Just my experience, rainwater harvesting being quite cheap, but obviously there's something going on with that comment. And just another comment, I know we've just harped quite a bit on the individual household water treatment of contaminated or shallow water. I certainly don't have a long-term study on this, but just from my experience of living and working in rural Mali, when our 2 hand pumps would go out and it was down to individual households to treat their water, it was very interesting to see how few of them actually did so, even when they knew the consequences, mostly just because of time. When you're a woman dealing with 15 members of the family to get water to, it's a big task to get the filtering, the chlorine done for that many people. I could hardly do it for my one-person household. So just something to think about when you go into individual behavior change like that.
Thanks. Let's take that one first, I think. Richard, do you want to say something about the cost estimate you mentioned earlier, and this again, we've got treatment coming up.
Yeah, I mean this is based on some the cost comparison was based on some recent work we did on the cost analysis of rainwater harvesting storage facilities, particularly ferrous cement, but also high density polyethylene manufactured tanks. But our focus was really on constructed tanks. So looking at the typical costs of those as against the amount of water they could provide on a regular daily basis in a reasonably favourable climate, fairly uniform rainfall, and then comparing with the cost of a rural water supply borehole and hand pump serving maybe 50, 60, 70 households. And if you look at the cost figures, you're talking roughly 10 times in the case of rainwater harvesting. You could argue you're getting more benefit from that though, because the water supply is right there at the home on tap. But nevertheless, the cost comparison I think stands.
Okay, in reverse order. So now we're going on to the question about managed aquifer recharge, as it's oh gosh, who brought it up? As it's commonly referred to. So, recharging groundwater.
I'm not a great fan of it, but I know an awful lot of people are. Sorry, people groaning over the corner there. I think it has got a lot of uses, managed aquifer recharge, particularly where groundwater has been extensively exploited and is very well managed. I think in an African context, I think trying to increase recharge to groundwater for something like for rural water supply is probably not a useful thing to do, because it doesn't demand a lot of recharge. I think innovative solutions like sand dams and things like that are very good. I would say that's slightly different from artificial groundwater recharge, but sand dams where there's not much groundwater, I think are excellent, where you create your own aquifer and then use that. I think are an excellent solution in a lot of places. And I'll tell you, one of my reasons I'm not that keen on, or I have my doubts sometimes about managed aquifer recharge, is a situation we saw in Gaza City, if any of you, some of you might have been there, where there is a lovely example of aquifer recharge system there, where they gathered up all the stormwater from Gaza City, put it in a big reservoir in the middle of the town to then recharge the aquifer, which was being overexploited. A lovely idea, except the water was so highly contaminated. It was just effluent really, and you could see this wonderful plume of very toxic groundwater going into that aquifer from this very badly managed aquifer recharge. So in short, managed aquifer recharge is brilliant if it's managed, and for that you need probably high technology in maybe the developed countries. In a lot of other countries where it's not well managed, it could be a problem.
I mean, to that, I guess I would add, in terms of intense, small-scale, community-led, managed aquifer recharge, one thinks, I guess, of watershed development in India in particular, and the transferability of lessons from an Asian context to an African one, and I think we'll see a lot more investment in soil and water conservation in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think claims will be made about their positive impact on water resources. But as in the Indian case, the claims can easily sort of pass into sort of policy rhetoric, and evidence gets of their actual effectiveness is very easily. If it's not shown to be hugely effective, the evidence is ignored because there's a huge amount of investment going onto it. anyway, lots of studies on the impacts of watershed development and managed aquifer recharge in an Indian context. The evidence is patchy in terms of having a real positive impact on groundwater recharge and groundwater storage. Richard, do you want to take up the question of energy and water?
Yes. If I understand, towards the end of your comment, your question, you asked me about desalinization, and you were talking about the huge amount of seawater, obviously, globally speaking, that's available. My first comment is that it becomes very energy intensive and very expensive water, and requires quite considerable infrastructure associated with not only the energy infrastructure but the plant infrastructure. And I think really it's the area of last resort in any water decision making process. Which, if you don't mind me getting on a little bit of a polemic again, which is why I'm immensely disappointed by Boris Johnson here in London, advocating for a desalinization plant in London when we have abundant groundwater storage beneath us, which goes a third of the capacity of the desalinization plant at Beckton is pumped out of the chalk every day to prevent the tube from filling in. So treating slightly contaminated groundwater in London is a much more sensible, robust solution to water scarcity than taking water out of the sea and expensive. But anyway, I'll leave that. Maybe people here from Thames Water can explain that to me in a more logical sense, and I'd appreciate hearing that. But I think if you want to go back to the African context, desalinization really is a post of last resort, really, just because of the energy intensiveness and the degree of infrastructure required by it. It becomes very, very expensive water on a per volume basis. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Good. Well, maybe Boris is watching online.
Well, that would be great.
Okay, well, the time is now, it's 7:35. So I'll finish just by saying, some of the literature that has been referred to by the three panelists here is hopefully still out there on the desk, including the project flyer and including a background note we did at ODI with BGS on climate change and groundwater last year, which we may, once we've come to the end of the current project, need to scrap and update. But I think most of the key messages in there are probably okay. There'll be a project website, incidentally, which you'll see on the project flyer. And finally, thanks for coming. Thanks for those watching online. And thank you to Richard, Alan, and Richard Carter for coming today. Thanks.